My name is Marc Hyden. I'm the National Advocacy Coordinator for conservatives concerned about the death penalty. And what we are is we're a national network of conservatives and some libertarians who believe that the death penalty is inconsistent with our core values. Now, I started this work, as I alluded earlier, after I worked with the National Rifle Association here in the Panhandle. And I was with multiple GOP campaigns before that, and I was a Republican Georgia State Senate staffer. And the reason I bring this up is to tell you that conservatism, it's very close to my heart. And for a long time, I just accepted the death penalty as another part of conservatism. But as I began to look at the facts, I started to soften my view on the death penalty. But I want to let everybody know, you don't have to take it just from me. There's some bigger guys out there. They could probably say it a little bit better than I can. Is anybody familiar with Jay Sekulow from the American Center of Law and Justice? He believes that capital punishment is inconsistent with conservative principles and lessens the possibility of redemption, and he was one of our earliest supporters. Colonel Oliver North. He is a great guy. If you ever get the chance to sit down with him, fantastic experience getting to know him. And he believes the death penalty is not only unnecessary, but it's dangerous. And he told me that personally. And everybody probably remembers he spent a little bit of time going through the criminal justice process, so he saw firsthand just how poorly run it really is. Richard Viguerie, does anybody know who that is? He's known as the funding father of American conservatism, and he was one of Ronald Reagan's aides. And he believes that capital punishment is no different than any other government program out there that we know to be rife with injustice. Michael Steele, the former RNC chairman, great guy, another one. If you get the chance to sit down with him, he's a fantastic person. And he believes that capital punishment is arbitrarily meted out, a real risk to innocent life, and a fiscal drain since it costs more than life without parole. Dr. Ron Paul's another. He recently endorsed my group's goals, and we felt very pleased, very proud to have his support. And he simply said, capital punishment is completely inconsistent with traditional conservatism. Now, each one of these political and thought leaders had their own personal journey that led them to believe that the death penalty was problematic for a variety of reasons. But today I'd like to go through my own personal journey. As a pro-life advocate, I had a real hard time justifying the death penalty once I found out that more than 140 individuals have been wrongly convicted, sentenced to death, and released from prison. Now, many others have actually been executed when there was serious doubt regarding the veracity of their verdict. And some of the people that have gone through this process are personal friends of mine. Meet Anthony Graves. He spent 12 years on death row and another 6 years in prison for allegedly murdering a family of 6, a terrible, terrible crime. The prosecution in his case fought tooth and nail to withhold the testimony from the real lone killer for being introduced into evidence until 2010, when Anthony was finally released because he was wrongly convicted. Carlos de Luna, on the other hand, was not so lucky. He was convicted and executed for allegedly murdering a gas station attendant in 1983 based solely on circumstantial evidence and the eyewitness testimony of one man who said he was 50% sure that de Luna was the perpetrator. Meanwhile, there's another man named Carlos going around town bragging about how he is the one that actually murdered the gas station attendant. Mistaken eyewitness testimony, like we see here, is a real problem, and it leads to many of our wrongful convictions that we see. And the stories like these actually happen far too often, unfortunately. But I do have a lot of people that come up to me and they say, Mark, you know, we live in this age of technology, forensic science, and DNA. Maybe this doesn't happen anymore. But today's reality resembles nothing like the CSI television shows that we see on TV. DNA is only available in up to 10% of all criminal cases. We saw recently that so-called forensic science is often pretty flawed. Right now, the Department of Justice is working with the FBI in tandem to investigate over 2,000 cases and 27 capital cases where unreliable testimony regarding a small thing such as hair analysis was used to convict alleged offenders. And What the government found is this form of analysis is completely unreliable and unscientific and may have led to some seriously disastrous consequences. And here's my case. Claude Jones. He was executed in 2000 for killing a man in a liquor store. The key evidence that was central to his conviction was based on a hair fragment that was found at the scene of the crime. And back then, forensic experts, just like today, they said, we're sure, we're positive. This is Claude Jones' hair, and science even backs up our claims. Well, after he was executed, DNA evidence revealed that that was not his hair after all. This should be pretty problematic. It should bother us as pro-life advocates and those who want to protect potentially innocent life. And, you know, since I'm in Florida, I want to talk about the Florida death penalty because it has a pretty poor track record. In Florida, we've seen 86 executions since 1979 and 24 wrongful convictions who were sentenced to death row and later released. We don't know how many innocent people were executed because the criminal justice system doesn't exist to go back and prove their innocence after the fact. So Florida actually leads the nation in wrongful convictions, and I'd love to tell you why Florida is the worst in the union at this. But I don't actually have an answer for it. It's more rhetorical. There's a nearly unique circumstance here in Florida that leads to their poor record. Florida is one of only 2 states in the union that are willing to accept a simple majority from the for the jury to sentence someone to death. Most states require unanimous jury consent, and Florida is one of only 2, and this only adds to the poor record that we see here. And the way that I see it, the way the death penalty is run today, it should offend those of us who are dedicated to protecting potentially innocent life and promoting fiscal sanity in government. Because everybody here knows fiscal responsibility and restraint is a pretty central concept in conservatism. But study after study has shown that the death penalty is far more expensive than life without parole. And it's even led to tax increases, and we all know that's a cardinal sin in conservatism. It's more expensive because the initial trial is many times longer than comparable trials with more motions, more witnesses, more experts, and a mountain of legal fees. Then there's an additional trial that's unique to capital cases. It exists just to see if the offender can receive a death sentence. Beyond that, we have to look at the appeals process. It's longer than any other in the criminal justice system, and it's so long that some offenders actually die of old age while they wait on the death penalty. Beyond that, you have to consider housing, because these offenders, or supposed offenders, are housed on death row, which is far more expensive than a maximum security prison. So to give you an idea of the cost and the length and waste of these cases, I'd like to tell you about Stacey Rector. She's a friend of mine in Tennessee, and she tried to get the transcript from a capital case, which is generally a pretty simple task, but she couldn't afford it. Not because she lives in poverty, but because the transcript was over 115,000 pages long. You stack that up, you bound that as a book, that book would be over 38 feet thick. That makes the Bible, or Atlas Shrugged, look like a pretty casual afternoon read. But somebody has to pay for this. And I'll go ahead and issue a spoiler alert. It's you and I. We're the ones that get stuck with the tab, and there's actually a long track record of capital cases pushing county budgets to the brink of bankruptcy and leading to tax increases. Jasper County, Texas, for instance. They raised their taxes by 7%, their property taxes, just to pay for one death penalty case. Gray County, Texas, they raised their taxes too to cover the cost of 2 cases. In Jefferson County, Florida, well, they nearly went bankrupt trying to pay for one death penalty case. And you have to ask yourself, is this really worth it? What do we get out of it? And usually the next question is, well, how expensive is the death penalty? And I'm not going to sit here and give you an exact number because it doesn't work that way. Each state pays for it differently, and the costs are carried on the local, state, and federal levels. But a few studies have been done that can give us a rough idea of the kind of physical abuse that we're really dealing with, and perhaps the most egregious of all case studies is what's happening in California right now. A study found that they've spent ballpark around $4 billion on the death penalty program and executed 13 people. I think we can all agree that $4 billion and 13 executions is a far cry from efficiency in government that we as conservatives want to see. But it's not just California. Maryland found that it costs $3 million just to reach a death sentence. That doesn't include appeals. It doesn't include housing. That's $1.9 million more than a non-death case. Texas, very similar. $2.3 million just to reach a death sentence. And that's 3 times the cost of imprisoning an inmate for 40 years in a maximum security prison. And once again, Florida's not immune. A study in 2000, which doesn't account for inflation, obviously, found that the state of Florida could save over $50 million a year simply by replacing the death penalty with life without parole or the possibility of release. $50 million. This should be disgusting. It should be offensive to conservatives, and even more so to the elected officials who are supposed to act as stewards of the taxpayers' hard-earned money, because conservatives know better than anyone that in an age of annual deficits and ballooning public debt that there's no sacred cows, especially when we're talking about government programs that are so wasteful, inefficient, and ineffective, just like the death penalty. But the high cost is not lost on many states. They know where they're losing money. They're not dumb. They're very good at accounting, as we've been hearing earlier today. So, in response, Governor Scott signed into law the Timely Justice Act to shrink the appeals process and make the death penalty cheaper. Timely justice, cheaper, quicker, sounds nice. But I'm reminded by something that Congressman Massey, I heard him say. If you want to know what a bill does, look at the title of it, and it'll likely do the opposite. And the same can be said about Florida's Timely Justice Act. It's supposed to make the death penalty cheaper, but the largest portion of the cost of the death penalty is actually in the initial trial, and that does not affect it. And after years of litigation, which probably will go all the way to the Supreme Court, it may shorten the appeals process. But at what cost? When you shorten the appeals process, you virtually guarantee that an innocent person will be executed by the state. And here's my point. Juan Melendez, I'm not sure if anybody is familiar with him, he was convicted of a really gruesome murder here in Florida. He spent 17 years on death row, fighting for his freedom, and finally one day someone found this transcript where the real killer had admitted to the murder that was pinned on him, and they found that the prosecution in his case had systematically withheld evidence. So he was released in 2002, but had the Timely Justice Act been implemented in his day, he likely would have been murdered by the state before he could be exonerated. Now, even going back to our forefathers like Benjamin Franklin, who opposed the death penalty, and President Madison, who also opposed the death penalty, limited government is a central tenet of Americanism and conservatism. But let's be honest with each other. Giving an error-prone government the power to kill its citizens, it doesn't really feel like limited government, at least not to me. And our government should be limited. Don't get me wrong. It's actually the state that decides whether or not to seek a death sentence. And it's the state that's implemented a framework that favors the will of the government in capital cases. You don't want the death penalty to be administered with the same efficacy and efficiency as the botched Obamacare rollout or VA hospitals, because life's too precious for that. The bottom line here is, if you don't trust the government to properly carry out mundane actions like delivering a piece of mail or efficiently running the DMV, then why would you trust them with this power? There's no greater power than the power to take a life. And currently, our government reserves the authority to execute U.S. citizens. But we as conservatives, we know better. We know better than to trust the government with this kind of power, because we've seen countless examples of the government abusing its power over the years. The human element in government and the human element in the death penalty process makes it susceptible to abuse and misuse. Now, personally for me, I wanted to find a reason to support the death penalty. And I thought deterrence was my reason. I was willing to sacrifice my principles, and I'm ashamed to say that. I was willing to accept. I knew that it wasn't pro-life if it risked innocent life. I knew it wasn't fiscally responsible if it cost more than life without parole. But I tried to tell myself that if it deters murders, more murders, than innocent lives that it takes, then I could call it pro-life. I could call it a deterrent. But several studies have come out and shown that there's no credible evidence showing that the death penalty deters murder. I mean, if it did, we would expect Texas, the state that uses it the most, year after year after year, to finally, by now, have the lowest murder rates. But they don't. In fact, they're not even remotely close to having the lowest. I think last I saw, they were ranked around 19 for murder rates. But not all murder victims' family members are subjected to this program because not all murderers are executed. The current system that we have right now has executed men like Carlos de Luna, while offenders like Jeffrey Dahmer and Charles Manson are not executed. I don't care where you stand on the death penalty. We can agree that a program that does that is not working right. Essentially, what the death penalty has become, it's a lottery of geography. You can commit 2 identical murders in 2 adjacent counties and receive 2 different sentences. One of life without parole and one of death, because most counties, they actually don't use the death penalty. They can't afford it. Only 2% of all death sentences, or the majority of all death sentences, come from only 2% of U.S. counties. This uneven and arbitrary use of capital punishment, it really offers no real reason why some people are executed and others are not. But I am happy to say that in the past 7 years, 6 states have repealed the death penalty, and a total of 18 have abolished it because they found that after years of trying to make it work properly, through numerous legislative, judicial, and policy changes, that it was irrevocably broken. And they couldn't fix it. They've tried. And with that being done, it shouldn't surprise anyone to find out that support for capital punishment is actually at its lowest point in 40 years. And a recent poll in North Carolina showed that 68% of North Carolinians support repealing and replacing the death penalty with a system of life without parole, while the offender has to work to pay restitution to the victims' families. And the majority of those who were polled were self-described conservatives. In closing, and we do have a few attorneys in the room, so I'd like to go ahead and apologize to you. I'd like to paraphrase a man by the name of Ron Briggs. He's an elected Republican official in California, and he and his father worked almost single-handedly to reinstate and expand the use of capital punishment in the 1970s. And he now opposes it. He said, close your eyes and imagine a government program that costs billions of dollars, gives all that money to attorneys and criminals, risks innocent lives, and many times fails at its central goals. What would you do with that program? And the answer is you'd repeal it. Now, I, like all of you, like all conservatives, I want to hold offenders accountable without being soft on them, because there has to be justice that's implemented for the order of society and for victims. But it's important to remember that we can still maintain our support for strict and rigid justice, but we have to be smart on crime too. We can't continue to support the death penalty when it's run so poorly. It risks innocent life. It hemorrhages taxpayer dollars when cheaper alternatives exist. And it gives the government a power that it neither deserves nor should be trusted with. But whether any of you out there support the death penalty in theory or biblically, I think we can all agree that our government doesn't run that program well or up to theoretical or up to biblical standards. It never has, and it never will, because there's no such thing as a perfect government program. And a program designed to kill guilty U.S. citizens has to be perfect, because when the government executes an innocent U.S. citizen, it becomes no better than the offenders that it's trying to execute. So the closing question that I want to leave with you guys is not, do some people deserve to receive death? The question is, do we trust an error-prone government to fairly, efficiently, and properly carry out this program? With that, I'll turn it back over to Brenda, and I really appreciate it.
Final question. How long has the group who is proposing, the group that you're representing, how long have they been doing what they're doing?
We debuted about a year and a half ago at CPAC 2013, but we grew out of a state coalition in Montana of legislators and conservative activists that all came together and found out that they all had some of the same issues with the death penalty, and many of those we've alluded to. We work closely with many murder victims' family members. Like I talked on the radio the other day with you, Ken, about Pat Monks or Helene Burns, many murder victims' family members that we work with. And the current system of capital punishment promises them a death sentence. And we saw how it's not used quite as frequently as it once was. So that promise is not always kept. Then it re-traumatizes them through a decades-long process of trials, appeals, and media attention, and in the end it turns the offender into a household name, while the offender, or the victim, is generally forgotten.
I'm just going to ask, have they worked on any solution? Because I think we have to have checks and balances.
Absolutely.
And if there isn't some type of check and balance, some people just
as we heard,
they just go rampant, you know. I mean, it's free, let's just do whatever we want to do, and it doesn't matter because there's no consequence in the end.
Well, as we heard earlier, there's...
Being a Christian, people believe that there is a consequence at the end. And somewhere, there needs to be some checks and balances. Now, fortunately, I've never had any of my family murdered or any of this. But you look at some of the people that have committed horrendous murders and been let out for one reason or another. And yes, it does take many years, which sometimes I think is too long. And if I were one that were wrongly convicted, I would really, feel justice is not served. But again, there's got to be some answer to committing crimes and some answer of whether it's a capital crime or whether it isn't. I don't know. I don't know the answer, but I just know that if you let people go unchecked and essentially not paying the ultimate price for something you've done that was terribly horrendous, it's not going to be a deterrent to anybody.
Well, I don't think it does deter. If you saw that there was 39 executions, and if you go back a little bit further, for about every 100 murders, about one of those results in a death sentence, and even fewer of those are executed, and they're executed 20, maybe 30 years later. Do you think that goes through the minds of someone committing a terrible act beforehand? No. So the death penalty, I don't believe, deters any murder in the United States. And you're right, there are some actions that are just so heinous. There's no way we need to release these people back into the general public. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people here have read The Law by Frederick Bastiat. And the role of government is to prevent injustice, not to cause justice, but prevent injustice. And that would mean not releasing these people back into society. And people like Bill O'Reilly, which I'm sure many people here listen to, he supports repealing the death penalty and replacing it with a system of life without parole while the offender has to work to pay restitution to the victims' families. And I believe that serves much more justice than possibly executing an innocent person. Because if you believe in the fallibility of man, the fallibility of the government, and you keep the death penalty on the books, you have to tell me how much collateral damage are you willing to accept in order to execute some wrongdoers.
I think you've overlooked one fact here, you haven't mentioned it. Life without parole does not mean life without parole. They always get out.
Well, there's a difference between life and life without parole. Now, have certain governors shortened the life without parole? I'm sure they have. I believe some people should not be released back into society, life without the possibility of release. But there is a difference between a life sentence and life without parole.
Look, man, in my case here, He got parole. They're going to get parole.
Well, I don't support that at all.
You don't.
But I don't want to. I don't want to
You
see.
didn't show me, give me any facts about that. In all your talking, you didn't give any facts or percentages or studies on how many men or women given life without parole got out.
Oh, well, it's not my specialty. My specialty is the death penalty, so I can't tell you that. But if you want to follow up with me afterwards,
Part of your study.
follow up with me afterwards. I'm going to get that information for you if I can.
I just wanted to bring up the point that just less than 3 weeks ago, there was a man, I'm trying to remember his name. His first name was Carl, his second name Dryden or something. I had to read that at home, but not here. He was on death row in Florida for 3 years, and then for review of evidence, especially DNA evidence, conclusively showed he could not have committed a crime.
Paul Hildwin, he was on death row for 30 years. DNA evidence showed that he likely wasn't the guy. It implicated someone else. And the system's so messed up, after the Supreme Court of Florida overturned that conviction, that man is still on death row while Pam Bondi decides whether or not she wants to retry him. And if you want to go 2 days ago, the 145th person to be released from death row was released also after 30 years because they found DNA evidence that showed that he was not guilty.
My sister and brother-in-law were murdered on Christmas Eve of 1989 on Guam. And they were shot by an ex-employee that they had been fired because he was on drugs. And they broke into the house and they held my brother-in-law down with a gun, and my sister was in the other room, and they walked out and they shot her in the back of the head. And then they went back, and my brother-in-law was still alive. They went back and then they shot him, and they went out in the front room and they sat there and watched TV. And then he decided, well, I was going to start to look around and see if there was anything in the money or something in the house. And my sister groaned, and the guy got up, and he got up so fast that he had a pistol. The pistol went off, and the bullet ricocheted around the room, ran over and shot my sister again. And with those 3 shots, they figured they better get out of the house. Well, they caught the guys. Now, one of the guys that was there was bragging about this thing in a bar, and this is on Guam, and they have the police are infiltrating the community, and they overheard this guy brag about being involved in this murder. So they caught the guys that did it, and this guy he was so afraid that he was going to get pretty close on the Guamanian, with the Guamanian, that he said, I'll testify against him if you promise me that you'll send me off the island to do my job. To my knowledge, those guys haven't been executed yet, but they should be.
How long?
They should be.
How long ago was that?
1989, Christmas Eve.
I mean, and I can't say anything other than my heart goes out to you, and I can't imagine, the pain that caused. And, unfortunately, that shows how broken the system really is. 19 years. And I'm sure they come up for appeals quite frequently. I'm sure the media reports on it, and you deserve better.
But the question is, what's the better?
I mean, I don't think that we should take the risk of killing innocent people to be able to execute a few bad guys, because there are some terrible people out there. I would rather keep them from ever being able to do this to anybody in the general public, keep them in prison. And I think the idea of possibly having them do some sort of work where they pay restitution, to pay their keep, to pay the victims' family members, I mean, I think that speaks volumes more justice.
How do you house this many people, as he said, the number of people that committed murders that are now going to spend the rest of their life in prison? That's going to fill our prison up with murderers.
It actually won't. So if you look at the actual numbers of people on death rows across the United States, he pointed out some pretty huge numbers of amounts of murders. There are only 3,000 people on death rows across the United States right now. The death penalty is not used that often, but you saw even the only 39 times that he mentioned, it still leads to tax increases. It's actually much, much cheaper to give them life without the possibility of release by millions of dollars per individual.
But again, as you point out, the system is broken. So what assurance would we have that they in fact are going to spend their life in prison without release?
Well, I mean, that goes to the jury, to the judges, to the prosecutors. You got to make sure that, but you have to put, and this is what the great thing about Tea Parties across the United States, you have to make sure you put pressure on your governors to make sure that they're not commuting life without parole sentences to something less. So, I mean, we're complicit in this. We have to be involved too, as well as the DAs and the juries across the United States.
Yes, in your research, did you run across any cases where a defendant would take the victim across state lines into a state that did not have capital punishment to commit the murder?
It's a good question, and I've never had that posed to me, and I actually am going to make a note to look at that.
Yes, there are cases where that's happened.
Wouldn't the lawyer say that's a federal case?
They cross state lines to avoid the death penalty.
There's a federal death penalty.
There is a federal death penalty, and they don't use it. They've executed 3 people. Yep.
I don't remember all the details, but our representative was telling us about the express lane that we have in Florida now.
Timely Justice Act.
I believe Florida requires tremendous amounts of evidence before they execute someone, like maybe 10 or more eyewitnesses and a lot of other, it's not just harshly, randomly killing people.
You're talking about the super due process that's supposed to be involved, and it has nothing to do with 10 eyewitnesses or anything along those lines, but it's called the super due process. And even with that in place, and with it being in place for so long, we see how often that the government actually gets it wrong. It happens far more often than we like to talk about. And then a lot of people talk about the Timely Justice Act and shortening the appeals process, and I talked about that. It's the appeals process that one of our attendees brought up. It took 30 years of appeals to clear their name. So when you shorten that, you virtually guarantee innocent people will be executed by the state. And you can look, it still doesn't make it much cheaper. You can look at Virginia. They have the lowest average appeals process that I know of. But it's not going to make it any cheaper because the attorney hours are still about the same. And the reason that the death penalty, I heard someone say it very eloquently, the reason why the death penalty is more expensive than life without parole is because attorneys cost more than prison guards.
Given the advancements in technology and criminology and such that you're talking about, I'm just curious as to how many, within, let's say, the past 5 years, death penalty cases have been overturned. You're talking about a lot of cases that happened 30 years ago, 20 years ago, where the technology we have today was not available. So
I think there's been 3 this year, but we're finding out, like I went over, a lot of the forensic science that they rely on is pretty faulty. I didn't go into this part of it, but the Department of Justice and FBI, when they were investigating how many possible wrongful convictions happened because of this faulty forensic analysis, it was so disgusting that they quit doing the study until someone forced them to go back and look at it. It happens today. It happened before. Technology, it's better than it was, but it's not foolproof. I mean, DNA is only available in up to 10% of cases anyway.
I don't have a question, but an answer actually to the question about people released that were sentenced to life without parole. No one sentenced to life without parole has ever been released on parole or received clemency from a governor in any state.
I like the answer.
Boy, I challenge that one. I challenge that one. I don't have the number in front of me. California, okay. Governor Brown, okay, yeah.
I mean, show me the evidence and I'll...
No, I understand. I'm saying I'm challenging you.
Thank you, Mark.
Hey guys, I really appreciate this opportunity. I really do. And I'll hang out if you want to talk a little bit more.